Thank you very much, Mark. And now we've got ample time for questions.
I'm a long-term union official. My family are union officials, but I've always sort of struggled with the relationship between the industrial and political wings of the party in respect of this particular issue. And I've always felt that the key is to bringing union members into the process, just exactly as you intimated at the end of your speech. So I'm busting to hear a little bit more about what you see as the future of the relationship between the union movement and the Labor Party, and how we could bring union members into the formal processes of the party if there is to be an ongoing formal relationship between the two.
Mary Gaudron, for whom I have the highest regard, gave, I think, a really thoughtful speech at the end of last year to the Labor lawyers in New South Wales, which got some coverage, where she, with an obvious deep sympathy for the role of unions in our broader social and economic fabric, suggested that it was time for the party and unions to formally separate. I don't agree with that. I think the structural relationship is a very important part of who we are as a party. It gives us a connection to hundreds of thousands of working families and their issues. It gives us a connection to, frankly, some of the most sophisticated campaigning capacity. But I do think it's time to democratise the relationship. And if you've read Greg Combay's fantastic book that he wrote after he left the Parliament, I think tragically left the Parliament in 2013, he argues for that sort of process. He argues for the democratisation of that process such that it operates through individual union members more than just sort of very centrally through party secretaries. And I say that as a former party secretary. I think there is value in continuing the idea of collective representation at 50%, say, at state conferences and national conference in policy-making forums, but voting, I think, should be individualised. I think there's great value in that, and I think that broader democratisation that we talk about in the party should also be seen through our party-union relationships. But as I said, I'll have something more to say about that next week.
It seems to me that Corbyn has made a huge impact. And he's broken with neoliberalism, which is very clear. He's bringing the British Labour Party back to what it was under Tony Benn. And I cannot really see this happening in Australia. The Australian Labour Party here is still very much wedded to the neoliberal agenda. And, you know, that's one question. The other question I've got is to do with what you are terming as populism. I think populism is a very vague term. I think what we've got today is a very far-right movement, which is kind of 21st century fascism, which is a very dangerous phenomena. And I think it has to be countered. And unfortunately, if we look at a mainstream party like the Liberal Party, they're going along with a lot of the kind of tropes that these fascists are, you know, particularly the latest thing with the African migrants and so on.
The party leader is, at a national level, the person I think who has responsibility for voicing party policy. So I don't see that as my role. Having said that, though, as a member of the Federal Front Bench, I do think that, as I said, for example, in relation to Chris Bowen's work, that some of our work in the economic policy space has been as progressive over the last 4 or 5 years as we've seen in federal Labor for a very long time. And I think that reflects a shift in the community sentiment and a community thirst for progressive economic and social policy. Now, reasonable people can have a good argument about that, but I might just leave that there. It is really important, I think, to be conscious of the distinctions between the operating environment for British Labor and Australian Labor. As I said, British Labor is a much broader church than the ALP has ever been. Really, I think that lack of an ability for far left parties, like the Communist Party or the Greens Party, to get any sort of political traction in a political system that doesn't have proportionally elected chambers of parliament means that British Labor has always been a broader church with a stronger hard left tendency. And it's not a new It's not a new phenomenon like our Greens Party is. It goes right back, as you know, to the 70s and the 80s as well. So I think what I wanted to do tonight was to talk about the organisational impact of Corbynism and the reforms that he really surfed that were initiated by Ed Miliband, rather than get into a debate about whether his policies are a bit too far left for Britain or whether they'd be a bit too far left for Australia or not. I don't see that as my role as the party president. My role is to talk about the running of the organisation. Having said that, though, there are clearly some policies that Corbyn pressed strongly, that Bernie Sanders pressed strongly, gained a lot of traction in the community and particularly among young people. And it's not just environmental policy issues or climate-related policy. They're basic economic policy, bread and butter issues, including around higher education fees and such like. So, you know, although it's not strictly my bailiwick, I think that the party should continue to look very hard and deeply at what has happened in Democrat politics over the last couple of years in the primary process and what happened in the election between Clinton and Trump, and also what has happened in a policy sense in Britain.
David Gabriel Jones, branch member in Melbourne. In your address you made one mention of Get Up, which inspires me to just speculate on the nature of membership in the 21st century. I'm a member of the ALP. Once a month I go to an upstairs back room in a pub in South Melbourne to join my comrades and think about politics. As a member of Get Up, I'm online all the time, day and night. Get Up exists in a virtual world, in cyberspace, and the level of activity and the level of relevance to the 21st century is miles distant from the relevance of the ALP as I see it. Do you have thoughts on the way in which the structures of the ALP should move into the 21st century?
I agree pretty much entirely with what you've said. We're not going to be able to become a Get Up, nor should we become a Get Up. They do great work, I think, on their particular platform, a platform I have no expertise in at all. But we really need to get much more active and much bigger. So when I talk about the fact that an individual seat in Britain, which is not much bigger than or much different in size to an Australian federal seat, can now have 5,000 or 6,000 members and registered supporters. They're not just rocking up to one branch meeting in a drafty pub once a month. If you have a look at what's happening in British Labor, they're constantly doing events. They're constantly engaged in activity. They are a genuinely organised movement. They're a movement that is out there working to local campaigns. They're not all working to the national political discourse of the day. They're working on national campaigns about planning issues, about pollution issues, about access to services. And that's what you get when you get bigger and you get better organised. So, of course, our party needs to operate on 21st century platforms. I mean, imagine what the Webs would have done with Facebook streaming in their day. But that can't be an entire alternative to traditional grassroots organising on the ground, knocking on doors, organising face-to-face events. And our party should be great at that, but we're not going to be able to do it with our current structures and our current size.
You haven't mentioned stability pacts between the factions to make sure that this seat might go to the Socialist left, this seat goes to Labor Unity and no challenge. And secondly, good old brain stacking, like in my seat in Melbourne Ports, even if the good Lord came down, he couldn't get the numbers because Labor Unity has done the job so well. How do we overcome those two?
The idea of opening up the concept of membership to registered supporters, a lot of the objection to that is grounded in branch stacking concerns, and a lot of that I think is self-serving. I think we found during the Brax-Carr-Faulkner review that factions are not only stacking, but they're stripping branches and they're sort of pulling levers to make sure that they get the influence and the outcomes that they want. And I lived through particularly the 1990s branch stacking across a number of branches, not just here in Victoria, and we put in place reforms to make it as utterly difficult as possible to become a branch member. And you just think like you had to be in the party for 2 years before you could exercise a vote for a state conference delegate. Imagine what that means to an idealistic 18-year-old who's sympathetic to the Labor Party. 2 years seems like an eternity for them. We corrected way too far. And again, reasonable people can disagree about this, but having thought about it for a long time, I think the only antidote to branch stacking is opening the floodgates, is just getting as many people in as you possibly can and making ourselves a truly broadly based mass membership party again. And then when that happens, the sorts of deals done about, oh, don't worry, we've worked out for the next 10 years who's running in every seat, Senate, Legco, House of Reps, House of Assembly or Legislative Assembly, whatever you call it here. The only way you can break those deals down is candidates think the members get a vote. Actually, the members get a say rather than the factional chieftains. So I have kind of the view, the only way you get that you strip out branch stacking and break the power of factional chiefs is through the power of numbers. And that's not easy. That requires a substantial organising effort by the party, and it will have sort of bumps along the way, I'm sure, but we've got to decide on a direction. We've got to sort of put that attempt in the 1990s to snuff out any idea of becoming a party member behind us and just sort of take the brave path that the British Labor Party has and watch the show become a truly sort of broadly based mass membership party again. And then the deals, they won't matter because people will stand up.
Sorry, but I've just been so anxious to speak because I am a member of the British Labour Party.
Oh.
And this is the party that, a lot of what you said is you'd like to be like the British Labour Party. Well, you'd like to have some of the success that the British Labour Party has had in attracting hundreds of thousands of people and in democratising. And I just want to say that that was not achieved by, organisational change and so on. I mean, the registered supporter thing was important. What it was achieved by was someone going out there and articulating a vision that was so utterly consistent, that was so utterly in tune with what people wanted in the country at large. And incidentally, Corbyn is not hard left. Corbyn is just, right in the middle of traditional Labour values. And the way that you're going to get 500,000 members or the equivalent in Australia is not through organisational changes. I mean, some are needed. The way you get it, in my opinion, is by having a vision that draws people in, and then when those people are drawn in support of that vision, they will demand the democratisation of the party, and that's what's happening in Britain at the minute.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great analysis.
I have been, a citizen for many, many years here. And I am very good at networking, and I've got lots of, migrant and refugee people behind me. But it's so hard to actually get them into the Labour Party. I mean, I myself had difficulty, for example, in party branches, in branch meetings, to feel being welcomed, okay? It's very basic. You come to a party branch meeting and you don't feel welcome. And I think, I don't know, there's a culture within the party branches that is not welcoming of people of diversity. And then when I ran for council last year, there's hardly, ALP people to help on the ground. No, they were all so busy doing other things. I don't know what to do. I want to bring in, my friends, migrants and, from different backgrounds into Labour Party, but reforms are needed. I am enthused with the new Labour Academy that is being set in place. I think we do need to orient, you know, and induct our members properly so that they know what they are getting into. And we do need, as the man said, vision, inspirational leaders, you know, and get rid of the branch stacking. Migrants are not the ones branch stacking. I mean, I don't know why there is such a stereotyping on that.
I truly am sorry that that's been your experience, and you know, I think what the idea that the only involvement you can have or experience you can have as a Labor Party member in between elections, if you like, is to attend a branch meeting, I think is part of our problem. I mean, it just doesn't reflect the way in which the vast bulk of people think about political activity. It was a structure that served us very well through much of the 20th century, and it's a structure that can continue, but not at the centre of our party, not as the centrepiece of party membership and party activity. There are some great examples of party activity and party organising, I think, that we've seen over the last number of years. Rainbow Labor, I think, is a wonderful example of that. It was changing the Labor Party that led the nation to change its view and to give the result that was given last year. But LEAN, the Labor Environment Activist Network, which I've worked very closely with in my portfolio areas, is another example. It brings party members together who share a passion about climate change, renewable energy and environmental protection, and they engage in a whole range of activities that play to that particular passion they have. And those are the sorts of organising, I guess, loci we need to find, rather than offering you one thing, and that is a branch meeting every month or maybe every 2 months. Now, they might still be useful in different areas where people do like coming together and questioning their MP or grilling their MP, but we've got to find other ways in which people can feel comfortable and engage in a type of activity that reflects their particular passions. And as to the last two comments, great political organisation means nothing if you don't have a product, if you don't have vision, if you don't have something that causes people to want to get out or get online or do whatever it is. You know, that I think is an important thing for all of us, particularly in the Parliament, to bear in mind.
We have a huge growing Chinese community in Melbourne. We have lots of growing diasporas, and actually engaging with them genuinely, not just using them to stack branches. I don't think migrants are stacking the branches. I think that factional heavies are getting in and bringing them in. So I reiterate your point. Mine was actually reflecting on the similarities, whether you think there are similarities between this era and the era where Gough Whitlam went up against Joe Chamberlain and the factional heavies of the 60s. How many similarities are there between now and then, and is there anything to learn from that period when it was the party, the program, the people?
Look, I don't think the difficulties aren't as significant as those that were facing Gough, and Gough and the people who worked with him, including at an organisational level like Clyde Cameron and Mick Young, to crunch through reform, were dealing with barriers that go way beyond what we are dealing with. The level of control by a few was extraordinary. It makes our show look like a vision of democratic flowering. There was also a very deep ideological schism in the party back then that I don't think exists now. There's obviously difference of view, but that sort of quite deep and profound difference in basic worldview that the Labor Party had for much of the post-war decades was also, I think, a significant factor that Gough had to confront, things like the school aid debate and things like that. If anything, I think the Conservative side of politics is the Liberal Party. The Liberal and National parties are facing a similar deep schism, deep philosophical divide about basic issues of worldview, similar to the one that the Labor Party, you know, if you like, faced in the post-war decades, the Fabian view of revisionism versus the revolutionary view of communism that split our party, caused lots of organisational disputes within the party and within trade unions, was largely resolved from sort of Gough's period through to Hawke and Keating's period. It is now it is now a deep problem for the Conservative Party here. It's not about Turnbull and Abbott. It is that there are two wings of the Liberal Party that have profoundly different worldviews, and that is not going to be resolved soon. So I think our position is much easier, frankly, than Gough had to confront. In a way, you know, our external operating environment might be a little bit more challenging and more complex, I think. You know, life was a bit easier back then. You know, you didn't have 24/7 media, you didn't have third parties by and large, you didn't have social media and all those sorts of things. But our party is, I think, in a healthier state than it was in the 60s.
Even though I'm a active member of my branch, such as it is, I still don't feel belonging. And it's for the very reasons that you articulated, and I think you articulated them very well. What worries me sometimes is that people seem to think that the solution is just getting more people from outside, but I think there's also the problem of alienating people inside. However, I thought what you said was very positive. I think that what you're suggesting in broad sense, though obviously there are lots of variations possible, is the answer. What I would like to hear you say is that after all these Labor Party worthies, including yourself, have been working at democratising the party for so long, and nothing substantial, I think, well, there's been minute moves. What is different this year that might make something happen?
I don't want to overdo the idea that there's a silver bullet here. This is tough work. No one understands that better, I think, than Victorians. The power of factional chiefs is difficult to shift. For my part, I think the leadership ballot, which is now some years ago, but the leadership ballot between Bill and Anthony was a revelation. You know, there were well-meaning people who thought this was a bad idea. And when, for example, we looked at how we're going to conduct the ballot, this goes a bit to your point about allowing people in or not. When we looked at how we're going to conduct the ballot, I and someone on behalf of Bill's campaign agreed that we would ask the National Executive to suspend the usual rules that would require people to be members of the party for, I don't know, a year or 2 years or something before they'd get a vote. Because what we found after the election loss and the idea that we were going to give members a vote, we were flooded. Thousands of people joined the party. They wanted to be a part to vote, but they also wanted to be a part of the process that, as you'll remember, had Bill and Anthony going out and doing debates, some of which were televised. And so we took the decision that actually we should, phone's given up, we should allow people in. And I think you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. Party members have experienced that process. It's not happening as regularly as it is in the British Labor Party, where they seem to be having a leadership election far more regularly. But you know, I think as we start to see those rules adopted at state level, we start to see them adopted for Senate candidacies, and they are being adopted in other branches. I think that you just won't be able to stop it. You won't be able to turn it back, I don't think. So there's not a silver bullet. I don't expect it to be easy. I'm not even sure we'll win the day at National Conference. As I said, you know, in spite of Bill being a Victorian and stating a very clear view from him about things like Senate candidacies being subject to a member's vote, the Victorian Conference, obviously enough of the key factional chiefs didn't want that to happen here. So it's hard work. But, you know, I think that the role I have, that the job I have, is to continue to articulate why this is not important for one group or another, or one Senate candidate or another who can't make it through the factional system. This is a critical issue for the health of our party in the 21st century. Like, we can't continue to operate like this. Our party internally is stultifying, and trust in the community, in our party organisation, we know is withering away.
Many Laborites have gone to the Greens. Adam Bant, who represents this particular seat, was a disaffected ALP type. Brad Orgel wrote a rather interesting book a few years ago why Labor needs our Greens. And he basically argues that perhaps Labor and the Greens should form an alternative coalition. That sort of strategy, I believe, happened in Germany at one point between the Social Democrats and the Greens. So how about that sort of thing happening in Australia?
The German experience was a really interesting experience because there was also a far left part of the Social Democrats, or whatever the party's called over there, that broke away as well, that brought in some of the old East German influences. So it was a really interesting coalition that I sort of watched very closely while it was operating. Look, I think, for my own part, I think the relationship between the Greens and Labor has a way to go. One of the deep frustrations we find in Labor is that the Greens uses the vast bulk of its energy trying to dislodge good Labor candidates, good Labor members. In New South Wales, for example, the seats are a bit, I'm not as familiar with the seats over here, but in New South Wales, almost every dollar the Greens expends in its federal election campaign goes to trying to defeat Albo and Tanya Plibersek. You can't get two more accomplished progressive members of the federal parliament than those two, I don't think. And so I think it's a relationship that is, if you use that sort of forming, storming, norming analysis, is sort of still in the storming phase. And I think it's more complicated than the coalition, the Conservative coalition, where there's a much clearer geographic delineation between the Nationals constituency and the Liberal Party. So I don't think that's under consideration anytime soon. In the meantime, I think it's a very difficult relationship between Labor and the Greens, particularly in the inner city seats in Melbourne and Sydney, and I suspect that will grow into some of the other cities as well. I went to the British Labor Party conference a couple of years ago in Liverpool, and it was for me, the most stark difference between our two parties. If you like, the broad left progressive constituency in Britain is all in one party. I imagined it like a national conference where we had the Greens and the Labor Party all in one hall and trying to manage that as the president. And I thanked my lucky stars I wasn't the party president of the British Labor Party, because it was a much broader church, fierce debates, deeply, deeply personal debates. Really, the level of, and this was after a pretty hard-fought campaign, but the level of open vitriol is something that makes us look pretty damn polite over here, I have to say. I think that's I talk about the philosophical divide within the Liberal Party at the moment. That is, I think, going to be a defining feature of federal politics for many years to come. Obviously, the Labor-Greens contest, if the Greens party survives, which I expect it will, unlike the Democrats, for example, I think is going to be a defining feature of the next many years as well, and one that Labor is going to have to continue to monitor and think about. But I don't think we're at the point of coalition forming.
Thanks, Mark. You mentioned earlier about the Senate reform being scuppered in Victoria by a procedural motion. That, in fact, happened in 2016, and basically what happened is that at the end of the rules debate, at the end of the day, a procedural motion was put basically to delay it to the next day, because they knew that there would not be enough delegates on the floor for a statutory majority. Last year, the Senate reform was passed on the voices. Then when somebody called for a count, again, it didn't get a statutory majority. This is after lunch. And had everybody who had been seated turned up, you would have ended up having about 20 more votes for it. So it's clear that people aren't turning up. Do you see scope for changing the rules of the party to not reward this kind of, to use a Keatingism, recalcitrism?
I think instead the way to deal with the very patchy approach that some of the branches, particularly the two big branches, have taken to implementing, I think, the spirit at least of some of the national reform direction has been the national rules just have to make them. And so there's got to be decisions at the national conference that make that decision for the branch. And if the branch, there've been a range of other ways in which we've done that. For example, on our affirmative action rules, if branches haven't implemented the national decision on AA by a certain time, it's made for them. It's made for them. And I think that's what we've got to do in relation to some of these democratisation reforms, because we're getting all this sort of silly bugger business by factions pulling delegates off the floor or stopping debate. Enough is enough, I think. Now, whether we can get that up at national conference is another question, and I think it goes to that question of the place within the conference agenda of this reform discussion. As I said, over the last couple of conferences, it's been right at the end, it's been rushed, it's been chaotic, and it's been heavily managed by a few factional leaders, and it's been seen as a sort of an afterthought. And instead, if you have a look at what the British Labor Party did, it was right up the front of their reform discussion. The leaders took part in it. It was made very clear to delegates that this was an important part of the conference business, not some sort of add-on that you could choose to come to or not. You might just want to duck off to the pub. This has got to be seen as a central part of this year's conference agenda, because, as I said, you do this work in opposition. You do this work in opposition, and I want this to be the last conference before we form government. So this year is the year to do it.
But just wonder if you might share your views, your reflection on if we are to achieve best case scenario with democratic reforms at the Adelaide conference, how a Labor Academy might perform a role in building capability to make sure those reforms are implemented and that they're actually working on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, for those who've worked in trade unions, particularly in the last 20 years, since the changes in the 1990s to the union operating environment, you know that there are basic skills and approaches to organising. And people who've worked in other activist organisations know that. We sort of lost it in the Labor Party. Like, the idea of organising is not a part of Labor Party business really in many states at all, if any. So, like, the whole great idea about your academy is to learn how to organise again, and to make sure that through the reform discussion we make this a core part of the business of every branch of our party. Yes, we've got lots of things to do. We need to win elections so that we can form government and make the sorts of changes that Labor Party supporters want us to make, social and economic changes. But as I said, to do that, we've got to be a healthy organisation, organising, growing our membership, doing the sorts of events rather than just a monthly branch meeting that keeps people engaged and active at a local level, requires dedicated resources, and it requires good training. And the Academy is going to be a very important part of that. So again, I thank you for the work that you and your colleagues have done on that.
Hi, Cynthia Pilley from Manningham branch in the seat of Menzies. And I just wondered if you'd comment on just a couple of issues that haven't been touched on. The first issue is about, what are your comments about, what do you feel about control of the candidates and what they can advocate for? A situation came up in the last state election where Doncaster Rail was really hot to trot. Manningham Council had put a lot of work into it. The community generally was pretty primed about Doncaster Rail, and our candidate really believed in it too. But because state Labor wasn't supportive of it, he said he wasn't even able to say, I believe in it, I will campaign for it if you vote for me. He wasn't allowed to mention it, and I just wondered what you thought about that sort of absolute ultimate control of what candidates can campaign for. Yeah. The second question is, given that we are considered unwinnable, Labor's unwinnable in our both state and federal, often in the branch, subsequent elections, there's been sort of pressure put toward, as the election coming up, for our funds to be donated to winnable seats. Because of the emotion around it, we've all sort of like had to feel we fall into line and yeah, okay. But it always seemed that, we were being exploited somewhat. And a lot of us believed, well, we've got to start somewhere, and Labor has won, or nearly won, in Doncaster.
As a general proposition, I'm a supporter of the long-standing Labor idea of caucus solidarity, that we have one voice on policy, and we all stick together. You get in the caucus, you get in a room, and you have your say. And once a decision is made on party policy, subject to the very exceptional idea of a conscience vote, you like it or you just have to vote with it. Now, this happens pretty regularly around the country, that there might be an issue that's deeply felt at a local level, but for one reason or another not adopted at a national level or at a state level. And I think the party organisation, in my experience, tends to try to take a sort of a common sense approach to give candidates a bit of leeway, short of completely contradicting state policy. I'm sorry, I don't know the circumstances of this one to know whether that happened. It is a tension, I guess, within the Labor Party tradition of caucus solidarity and the perhaps increasing expectation that there will be local advocates. And I think that's something that I think over the sort of 20 or 30 years I've been involved, I've seen the party generally take a more flexible approach to than they might have back in the 1980s or 1990s. The question of resources, I think, again, is one. I'm not familiar with your circumstances, although I know your seats. It's quite common around the country that branches or FEAs or FECs will support a neighbouring electorate. That's a great thing about our party. I do think, though, that what the experience I try to outline in some detail about our Senate vote is I think reflects the fact that across the country we haven't paid sufficient attention to campaigning in safe Liberal seats, including in country areas. And what we found when we reviewed the last election campaign is that where a strong Senate campaign was run across the state, not just in traditional Labor seats or in marginal seats, where it was won across the state, we got a much better Senate result. So in my state of South Australia, where we were faced with the very deep challenge of Xenophon, we ran a strong Senate campaign, headlined obviously by Penny Wong, radio ads, local campaigns, corflutes in Liberal seats, Labor seats, marginal seats. And I think it's hard to tell because it was such a weird election for the Senate in South Australia, but I'm confident, and I think generally the view is we did much better. So we did start to, I think over the last couple of decades, we started just to increasingly discount campaigning in traditional Liberal and national seats. And I think we've been thinking through over the last several years that that was a mistake. And it undervalued the contribution by party members, supporters and voters in those electorates, and it was doing us damage, particularly in areas like the Senate vote.
You mentioned before about the success that both Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn found in pulling in votes and members into their ranks through an economic message, like a bread and butter message. What lessons do you think there might be for the Labor Party in relation to that, with providing an economic message focused at young people to bring them in to the ranks of the Labor Party and ultimately increasing our membership numbers, which is pretty needed?
Yeah. I'm a Labor Party member and branch executive member in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. I'm just interested in hearing your reference to the British Labor experience in relation to the growth of beyond 500,000 members. Was there, in your knowledge, a nationally coordinated approach to developing that membership? And secondly, do you think that that could be applied in Australia? I think the problem that we've had over time is that there have been references to growing the membership to a particular figure, whether it be 100,000 or otherwise, without there being the roadmap on how to get there, and being agreement and coordination between the national level and the state branches on doing that. The second question would be in relation to an ongoing presence of the Labor Party at the local level. As a branch executive member now for nearly a decade, I guess I've experienced some frustration in hearing people over time saying that branch activity doesn't draw people in or is perhaps not particularly exciting or attractive. in the alternative of branches existing in the way that they currently are, what do you see as options?
In response to Stuart's discussion about the Labor Academy, you do need a structured approach to organising. It needs to be, in a disciplined way, seen as a core part of party business, and there was an organising plan in Britain. And it's been so successful that when you now go to Britain, you can go to constituencies where there is such a level of membership and registered supporter base that it finances organisers at a branch level. It's really quite something we can't even comprehend here. As I said, Corbyn's seat has probably close to twice as many members in one seat as South Australia has. Like, it is the level of the critical mass you get there from shoulders to the wheel, stomping the ground, but also money to sort of, in a self-sourcing pudding way, finance organising is a long way from where we're at. But that's sort of what we've got to think about. So again, this is not rocket science. I mean, trade unions do this. That sort of structured approach to organising must be recognised top down and run right through the branches. It's not easy. But if we don't do that, then we're just sort of pulling numbers out of thin air, and we probably won't get very far. Again, in response to a couple of the questions, I've said that I don't see the branch meetings going. I think there's still value in branch meetings. People, there are big parts of our membership who like that disciplined approach, and as I said, that ability to grill their MPs and such like, and to have a debate and receive visitors. I don't see that going. It's just you've got to put other stuff on top. Other ways of allowing members to come together, get active, debate issues that are particularly part of their passion. And I think we've done that in one or two policy areas, but we haven't done it enough. And it comes up every time we do a review of our party, our structures and our culture. To the first point about the alternative economic vision that was outlined by Sanders and by Corbyn, as I tried to sort of say, this wasn't intended to be a policy speech, but I tried to say, I think broadly our frame around economic policy and what's happening in Australia, wage stagnation, massive underemployment, growing inequality, has been a more progressive, in economic terms, a more progressive narrative than Labor's had, I think, in all the time the 30 years I've been a member. And it's from Bill down. It brings in people like Wayne, who's a long-standing, credible economic policy thinker, who's really motivated now by trying to lift the debate around inequality. It's buttressed by our social policy people led by Jenny Macklin. I don't think we should be hard on ourselves. I think we are presenting a very compelling, alternative, progressive frame around what's happening in Australia now. That's quite different to what we saw in Labor post-1980s. And, we can build on that, we can fill in some of the gaps, but I don't think we should understate the degree of shift to a much more progressive frame, particularly in economic policy over the last 4 or 5 years.
My question is about new members and new membership. So when I started up as a member, it was really hard to navigate the landscape of the Labor Party. I wanted to be a member. As soon as I signed up, I wanted to get involved, and I wanted to be in the thick of it. Finding your way around party structures. I knew I went to a branch meeting, and luckily I had great branch members to sort of guide me through, and Andrew himself. It was really hard to feel you have a difference straight away. When you sign up, you're empowered, you're going to make a difference, you are going to, with all your labour and all your might, you are going to help beat the Tories. That's what you wanted to do. Getting there, it's a little bit hard and it's daunting. So there are rules, and you can download the rules, they're accessible, but they're not that digestible for a new member, or someone who isn't used to reading Section A, point 2, dot point C, or something like that. It's really, really tricky, or having to reference different parts. So what I was going to get at is, as a party, to move forward, to get new members, to retain members, to empower those members to go out and spread the good news of the Labor Party, we need more induction, and we need more empowerment of new members. Get them when they're fresh and get them going. So luckily I was able to find my way around, and at the Scullin branch we've had a new member orientation day, which we've ran once, which was really good. And that was great to get new members in, sit them down, explain, this is the party, this is what it does, these are members, MPs, how they're selected, what the union's role is, and even how factions work. The whole shadowy world of factions isn't really spoken about, but it's part of the way the party is, and if it is going to be an official structure, new members need to know what it is, how it works, and that it is the boogeyman or it isn't the boogeyman. So
Yep,
that was
really
just
good
my thing,
points.
just new party members need to be inducted, and inducted well, and informed.
Thank you. They're really good points.
I've been fingered as the Labor tragic of the Fabian Society, and I came from a family of great Labor tragics. And the thing about being a Labor tragic is that every now and again someone goes and breaks your heart. And in fact, a lot of you are here tonight because you love the Labor Party, you love the Labor movement, and there are these people who repeatedly break our hearts. Very selfish people. People who go and damage Labor in a way that would, in the end, damages the people who need us. And so it's not just self-indulgence, it's actually a deeply antisocial act of selfishness in these faction leaders. And it's a very depressing thing, and I think that Mark has given us tonight a range of hopeful initiatives and ideas which we hope will eventually begin to get rid of this cancer in our midst. So we're... Our midst. Sorry, I can't hear you, I'm a bit deaf. That's right, so... there's been a lot of talk about the British Labor Party, and there's one problem they have that we don't have, which is a huge gulf, a huge cultural and class gulf between their political class and their members. And it's been the response of Blue Labor to try and bridge that gulf where the political class inhabits an entirely different cultural world from the people they are asked to represent and help. We don't have that, and to an extent the Greens have taken off that bit of Labor, and they're turning, particularly in Melbourne now, and where I live, in my seat, into a NIMBY party, and becoming not in no way a left-wing party at all. What we do have to try and remember is to keep ourselves together and to make the party a mass party in a true sense, to be drawing in large numbers of union members as either full members and their membership of the union paying their membership of the Labor Party and as registered supporters. This is the most hopeful thing that could happen to us. We don't want to divorce branches from the unions. That is our source, that is our heart, that is what keeps us honest. And we need their skills. And if there's a good story in Victoria, and this is my last point, there's two things happening here, apart from Lean and Rainbow Labor, which have great hope. And first is the Community Action Network, which has worked for elections and which has done an extraordinary work in particular seats in doing just that sort of grassroots community work and getting people. And now we've got to start extending that, for instance, to our African communities who are feeling particularly isolated at the moment. The other group that are doing this is the Community Action Network. Oh, sorry, I've lost my other point. Okay, so the good things happening in Victoria. The other one is the Trades Hall, where under Luke Hilakari, the Trades Hall is now teaching a whole generation of young people, many of whom came over from Rainbow Labor, about how to organise. We've got these skills, we've got to start putting them into action, and it's only at that grassroots level that we'll do it. Thank you, Mark, for being a great leader of the party as party president, and we just keep all our fingers crossed, and if any of us are lucky enough to be chosen to go to conference, we know what to do. Thank you very much.